Yes, I got it. Okay, we are recording. Well, what do say you guys? Should we do the last of the propositions? Let's do it. I'm so excited. Okay, can you all see my presentation up? Cool. I got the thumbs up from Mrs. Mikami. All right, let's check them out. So for those of you who weren't last week, I'll just say a few notes really quickly. I've been doing these proposition parties since 2008. I do a lot of research on the propositions and decided at some point that it might be helpful if I shared my knowledge. So we did 7 last time. We're going to do 5 this time. And I'll review the basics. We'll talk about what it says, what it will actually do, who paid for it. And I would love to hear your questions, comments, any discussion. I will say, don't use the chat. I mean, you can use the chat. I have my wife Susan over here monitoring it, so you can use the chat. But we're a few people. A lot of people wrote to me, "Hey, I'm going to go watch this on YouTube because I want to watch the debate." So what's exciting is that we can actually have a conversation without 20 people on the call, 30 people on the call. Just don't hesitate to speak up. So I would love to hear your thoughts. I don't have all the answers. I don't pretend to. I do a lot of research. I know as much as I know. So if you have a good question, we might ask one of you to look it up. The more perspectives we have, the better. Courtesy and open-mindedness are sort of prerequisites for hanging out with us tonight. I am recording the session. And for those of you VisBees who are on the call, this is not a VisBee sponsored event, even though it's on the VisBee Zoom. All right, last couple of statements. If you already think you know how you're going to vote, I just ask you respectfully to suspend that certainty just for the next hour and 15, because I really want to make sure everyone has an open mind. Every law designed to work for 39.5 million people is going to be flawed. So if it helps some people, it's going to hurt other people. And we want to keep all that in mind as we cast our votes. Something that can be really easy to do is pay attention to the ads on TV. They're going to start coming at you fast and furious. And when you see the ads, it's easy to be like, yeah, I'm going to stick it to the man. It's not that simple. It's never that simple. Lawmaking is never that simple. So we want to make sure we have open minds and we're ready for complicated issues. We've got some real complicated ones tonight. 4 out of the 5, I'd say, have a fair degree of complexity, but really all boil down to one question or another. So I'm really excited to share all this with you tonight. Giving a shout out again to ballotpedia.org. They have unbiased information. They're a nonprofit. A lot of this presentation that you're going to see is taken directly from their website. They've done a lot of work. I want to give them a shout out. And as a nonprofit, I donated. And if you enjoy anything in this presentation and it helps you, go on to Ballotpedia. I'm sure they'd love to get a donation. You guys ready? Let's do the prompts. Let's do them. Oh, I can't wait. These are good. Okay, let's talk about Prop 21. This one is about rent control. And a lot of you are going to say, rent control? Didn't we just vote on that 2 years ago? Yes, we did. So we will cover what this proposal does. We'll cover what the last one said. What are some of the differences? And this is a very complicated topic that can seem very simple. So the first thing that I will say is that this is an initiative state statute. So it got on the ballot through signature collection. What does a yes vote do? A yes vote allows local governments to enact rent control on housing that was first occupied over 15 years ago, with an exception for landlords who own no more than 2 homes with distinct titles or subdivided interests. A no vote does the opposite. It opposes it. It continues to prohibit rent control on housing that was first occupied. Basically, it's 25 years versus 15 years. So 25 years ago, and housing units with distinct titles such as single-family homes. So I will get into some details in the following slides. So a little bit more detail here instead of just yes or no. So it allows local governments to establish rent control in these properties over 15 years old. It allows local limits on annual rent increases to differ from the current state limit. It allows rent increases in rent-controlled properties of up to 15% over 3 years at the start of a new tenancy, above any increase allowed by a local ordinance. So what it's saying is you can raise your rent 15% over 3 years. So you could raise it 15% in the first year, which would be a nasty surprise for a tenant. and then that you're done, or you can do it 5% a year, but that's sort of what it looks like. And because with this ballot, it gives local governments more control to enact this rent control, the local could say it can be more or it can be less. So there's some more local control here. It exempt individuals who own no more than 2 homes from new rent control policies. So what it's saying is, look, if you're just a retired person who owns a rental, one, we don't want to have you do rent control, but what we want to do is make sure that companies who are making a lot of money, big companies, use rent control to take care of their tenants. So in accordance with the law, it prohibits rent control from violating the landlord's right to fair financial return. So let's say if, in the 3 years, the market price, taxes went up higher. Let's say, in fact, that we vote in Prop 15 and property taxes go up. So if property or commercial property taxes go up, then that could affect the market, the margin that these people will make. And what it says is, hey, listen, you're still going to be allowed to make money if you own a property and you're renting it out. Fiscal impact to the state, a potential reduction in state and local revenues in the high tens of millions of dollars. Depending on the actions by local communities, it could be less or it could be more. And that's because the property owners, when they make more money, they increase the rent, they make more money, they pay more taxes on that. So it could be less taxes, fewer taxes getting to the state. So most of this presentation is from Ballotpedia. It's kind of complicated how rent control works in the state currently. So I actually pulled this off of the website of the Legislative Analyst's Office, which is a government-run but nonpartisan website. So I thought they did a good job of explaining it. So here's what's, rental housing is expensive in California. Renters in California typically pay 50% more for housing than renters in other states. In some parts of the state, rent costs are more than double the national average. Hello, San Jose. San Francisco. Rent is high in California because the state does not have enough housing for everyone who wants to live here. People who want to live here must compete for housing, which increases rents. So supply and demand. We don't have enough housing. Too many people want it. It's expensive. Several cities have rent control laws, including LA, San Francisco, and San Jose. We already have laws that limit how much landlords can increase rents for housing from one year to the next. Oh, whoops. These laws are often called rent control. So about 1/5 of everyone in California lives in a city with rent control. So these are carried out by local rent boards, and then those boards are paid for with fees that are placed on landlords. So the landlord has to give a little fee so that they can run the rent control board and make sure that everything's working the way it should. Courts have ruled that rent control laws must allow landlords to receive a fair rate of return. So that this again means that they can make some profit every year. Okay, so a little background, a little more. There was a law known as Costa-Hawkins. It limits rent control laws. Costa-Hawkins creates 3 main limitations. First, rent control cannot apply to single-family homes. Second, rent control can never apply to any newly built housing completed on or after February 1st, 1995. Third, rent control laws cannot tell landlords what they can charge a new renter when first moving in. Okay, that makes sense. I do want to draw your attention to why do these laws say, it can never apply to newly built housing after 1995? And why does this current prop say, well, not anything that's built in the last 15 years? Main reason is that because the housing, the rent prices, high rent prices are a product of supply and demand. You want to do whatever you can to encourage the supply. So you want to encourage new buildings. And what happens is when you have developers, they build buildings because they want to make money. They want to make money off of that property. And when you have rent control laws, they know that they're going to make less money than they would make if they built somewhere else. So rent control, and this is, as I've been reading about it these last couple of weeks, it works really well for people in the short term. And long-term, really, if you're a tenant and you're in a rent-controlled property, it can really make a big difference in your whole life. You get security, you have, low rent. You won't get that shock of, oh my gosh, my rent went up so much that I can't afford to live here anymore. You have more stability in your housing. Long-term, though, rent control has been shown to reduce the amount of supply. It reduces the number of new housing that goes up. So that right there is going to be the crux of your decision about rent control. Like, okay, do I want to put in rent control? I help the tenants, but long-term, I'm going to discourage new buildings. Or long-term, do I want to say, keep the limits that we currently have on rent control so that we can encourage more people to build out? So in addition to local rent control adopted by Costa-Hawkins, a new state law, and this was passed, by the way, in October of 2019, so it's just a year old, limits rent increases for most rental housing in California. Landlords cannot increase rent by more than 5% plus inflation in a year, or 10%, whichever is lower. This applies to most housing that is more than 15 years old. This law lasts until January 1st, 2030. So that's kind of interesting, because doesn't that sound similar? It sounds very similar. Like, we just passed a law that says you can't do it more than 5% versus 15 over 3 years. That sounds similar. Housing that is more than 15 years old as opposed to 20, this one says 15. Okay, this sounds very similar. So the law we just passed does sound very similar to Prop 21. And you'll note that this law has, what do they call it, a sunset date, which is 10 years. And why is that? That is because we know that in the short term, rent control can work, but in the long term, it discourages more housing. So that's actually how Gavin Newsom wrote it. He wrote it so that it would have an expiration date. State and local government tax revenues. So 3 taxes are the largest source of revenue for the state and local governments: personal income tax, property tax, and sales tax. State collects a personal income tax on income, including rent received by landlords. Yeah, okay, so yeah, that's how we collect taxes. That's good background. Okay, so what did we reject 2 years ago? This would have allowed local governments to adopt rent control on any type of rental housing. We turned it down. 59% said no. This AB 1482, this is the law that we're just talking about that was passed last year. This caps annual rent at 5% plus inflation. It also requires that a landlord have a just cause to evict tenants that had occupied the rental for at least 1 year. So additional protections for renters. AB 1482 included exemptions for housing built in the past 15 years and some single family homes and duplexes. So it was designed to sunset, and it was signed last October. So that's the current state of affairs if we do nothing. Who supports it? Bernie Sanders, Maxine Waters, the Democratic Party, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Actually, the leader of that foundation is the one who put this on the ballot this year and 2 years ago. And you know, something that I want to note for anyone who's new, who wasn't here last week, it's very tempting to just look at the supporters and say, hey, I'm a Democrat. Hey, I like Bernie Sanders. I agree with him, and I'm just going to green light it because somebody I like agrees with it. And I would just encourage you not to do that. I would encourage you to really think about it because, as I said last week, I have a wonderful wife, and we hardly ever fight. But I disagree with even her sometimes. And we're like really on the same page about mostly everything. So I imagine I would disagree with Bernie Sanders about some things too. So it's never just as simple as, hey, I like that person, I'll vote with them. Arguments in favor. So Michael Weinstein is the fellow who put this on the ballot. So, you know, he's stating the obvious, right? Among the 17 million renters in California, the suffering is unabated. We have increased homelessness, and the affordability crisis has reached epic proportions, with many people paying 50% or more of their income to keep a roof over their head. I've got a few statistics on that towards the end. Bernie's in favor. Basically, what he says is he was born and raised in a rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn. The most minimal form of economic security was crucial for our family. But today, that type of economic security does not exist for millions of Americans. The David Huerta talks about housing insecurity, and he also noted that the COVID-19 pandemic has made that worse and resulted in disproportionate suffering for workers in low-wage jobs, workers of color, and immigrant workers. So in his view, because of systematic exclusion and racism, these families have lived in crowded conditions under constant fear of eviction, and they never know when their rent is going to go up. So those are the arguments in favor. Media editorials, the Los Angeles Times agrees that we should pass this. And one thing that you'll note about what the LA Times says, and by the way, for everyone, if I start flipping through these a little bit quickly, I will send out copies of these presentations tomorrow morning. But even LA Times admits that this isn't going to solve the problem. So in order to really solve the problem, we need reforming zoning codes. We need to reform the regulations that make it impossible to build apartments and townhomes in many communities. I will say, as someone who is in charge of real estate projects, it is very difficult to get a real estate project through a lot of the hoops that are in California. We have a lot of work to do, is basically what the Times is saying. But look, until we do that and until we build more housing, this is the answer. So who's against it? Gavin Newsom's against it. He's like, yo, I took care of this already. I did it. You don't need to do this. Let me work. And then these unions are against it. Of course, property trusts and all those kind of people are going to be against it because it means less movement in real estate. And then against it is also California NAACP, so all of those folks. Arguments against. So this fellow Thomas Aiello was basically saying what I pointed out before, is that it discourages more building, so it limits supplies. Sid says that it just doesn't work. We rejected it in 2018. We should do that again. Gary Passmore, who is the president of the Congress of California Seniors. I didn't know that existed. Maybe we should join that, honey. Mm-hmm. It provides no protections for seniors and would hurt senior renters and homeowners alike. A lot of times a senior community might be against this sort of thing because there are seniors who might own one rental home or two, or maybe they own three, and maybe this could really hurt them. They've set up their retirement based on income they're going to get from rentals, and this will take that away. Gavin Newsom, let me work. It's not going to work. I should have put the full link in there, but you can look up that article. So the Brookings Institute a couple of years ago did a really great article with some background, and it's great reading. So if you feel like looking up that article, it's really good. It gives a lot of good background. So these media editorials basically say the same thing. So it's the same for and against arguments. The money, we always look at the money. So for support, in order to pass it, they collected $24 million. These numbers are updated, by the way. Last week's numbers were a little bit out of date. These should be only a week or two old. Oppose, we have $41.5 million. This is fairly big money, not some of the biggest money we'll see. And we have the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, as we said before, contributing most of it. The opposition, it's a lot of PACs, and then it's a lot of realty. The realtors don't like it. They don't want rent control. State policies, I just thought it's cool to include a little bit of background, so you can check this out when I send out the presentation. But most prohibit rent control, and some are agnostic, and then just a few states allow it. And then just looking at the median rent, now this data is a little bit old as of 2016, but it shows how high, when you look at the highest numbers, clearly that's going to be in our area. So I thought that was kind of cool to look at as well. And then this actually gives between 2016 and 2010, like how much did it go up? So for us, if we look at San Jose down here, it went up by 26%, the average rent. That's a lot if you're out there trying to pay rent out there, right? But here's another interesting piece of data, which is that 53% of our population in San Jose, 30% or more of their income goes to rent. And what we found in studies is that that's not a really good balance. That it makes it very hard to live. So I just thought that was really good data. So questions, discussion? Does anyone have an opinion they would like to voice or know how you're going to vote? No? This is a tough one. Lots to think about. Are we ready to move to the next one? Okay, because the next one is the easiest one we're going to deal with tonight. It's actually boils down to a fairly simple issue. So this is a California initiative state statute. So again, got on with signatures. Requires physician on site at dialysis clinics and consent from the state for a clinic to close. Fairly simple, right? So they have to have a doctor on site, and if they want to close a clinic, they have to get permission from the state. And it also says, if you look at the yes, and does not discriminate against patients based on the source of payment for care. So they can't turn someone away if they don't have insurance, basically. It sounds pretty reasonable. Not too bad. So, okay, licensed physician, blah, blah, blah. All right. Fiscal impact. I don't remember why it would cost us low tens of $1 million annually, but in the state of California, we have a $209 billion budget. Tens of millions is actually not much. Okay, so how does it relate to the one we voted on 2 years ago? Because I know what you're thinking, didn't we just vote on this? Okay, so in 2018, about 60% of us rejected Prop 8, which would have required dialysis clinics to issue refunds to patients for profits above 100%, 15% of the costs. It also was designed to enact policies related to dialysis clinics, but the specific policies are different. Prop 8 would have capped profits and required refunds, whereas this year's initiative would address minimum physician staffing, data reporting, and clinic closures. So what is this really about? Prop 8 is really about the union. So this union is a labor union for healthcare workers. Has been trying to unionize the workers in the dialysis clinics for a long time, and they're not having a lot of luck. So what they're really trying to do is get some leverage and exercise some power by showing the dialysis clinics that they are able to influence the law. So this, like we saw Prop 22 last week, it's about a fight. People are fighting, and they're having us decide. Will you decide our fight? Will you help influence our fight? And so one of the questions that you want to ask yourself is that how the ballot initiative process should be used, right? I mean, look at all the work it is for us. We got 12 propositions on this year's ballot. There could be many more if we send that message that this is the way to settle arguments. So this is basically about the conflict. So they've been trying to unionize. This is just leverage, says an opposition spokesperson. A spokesperson for the union says that the dialysis workers want these initiative reforms regardless of what happens with their union efforts. And I will say that there's almost no good guys in this fight, because there's one side that's trying to leverage us and force us to do what they want them to do so that they can gain position. But the other side, the dialysis clinics, if you want to do some research on that, it's very interesting. They don't appear to be the good guys either. They said a lot of dialysis clinics are really run like kind of just automation centers. There's not really a lot of care going on there in a lot of cases. So this one's a little bit sticky, and it's a little bit like, do I really want to get involved in this? So the support is that union. The opponents are the dialysis clinics. Something that's interesting that I want to call out, I'll save that for later, but you'll see the NAACP in a lot of these. So this is a lot of money. Take a look at the opposition. So, okay, the union put $6 million into it, that's fine. The opposition, $93 million. That's a lot of money, y'all. Some of the most expensive propositions we've ever had were like 120 million. So it's clearly worth a lot to the dialysis clinics to shut this down, which might be a reason you find to say, there's something's got to be behind it. If it's worth 93 million, then they stand to lose something. So it's something to think about as you're making a decision on how to vote on Prop 23. Okay, so here were the, no surprise, the opposition was the clinics themselves. So Ballotpedia did not identify any media in support, but there are plenty who are opposed. Basically, they're just saying, these guys are fighting, and do we need to weigh in on it? So I won't go into too much detail here, because this one, again, is pretty simple to understand. These are all still against the proposition. And what you'll see here that I find interesting is that when you look at the opposition, you see Orange County Register, which is typically right-leaning media, and you also see the LA Times, which is very left-leaning, all saying, no, don't get involved. So it's really interesting. I'm sure you'll see plenty of ads coming out in the coming days. That's it for 23. What questions do we have on 23? Does anyone know how they're going to vote? No?
I have a question.
All right. What do you got, Graciela?
What exactly, besides the physician on staff, does this proposition add to dialysis clinics? Can you go back to that slide? Sorry.
No, that's all right. It basically says you can't close it. Let's go back. Let's go back in time. There we go. You can't close a clinic without getting permission from the state. Oh yeah, that's why there's fiscal impact, because the state will have to approve. So what they're trying to say is that these dialysis clinics are basically just operating for profit. So if you have a dialysis clinic, say in a low income neighborhood where people don't have good insurance, and the dialysis clinic isn't making a big profit off of it, they're saying, hey, you can't discriminate, and you can't just decide to close that clinic because you're not making enough money. You got to ask the state whether that's going to be okay for the residents there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes more sense.
Oh,
I've been to.
and
Go
by
ahead.
the way, that second bullet point, it requires them to report infection data to state and federal governments, because that is one thing that we've seen that happens at a lot of these clinics. If they're not well run, if there's not a doctor on site, if they don't do it right, it can cause an infection. What they're saying is you have to report that.
Yeah. I am an EMT, or I was in Ohio. So I've been to a lot of these, and they're basically run like McDonald's.
Right. Yes.
You show up, you get your dialysis, and then an EMT takes you home if you are not able-bodied. So I'm actually for the proposition. I think the dialysis centers, especially Fresenius and DaVita, are grossly underregulated. And if you're interested in like hearing more about this, I think 2 years ago when this was on the ballot, John Oliver on his TV show did a bit on it about how centers like this, they would use a vial of medicine, wouldn't use all of it, toss it, and then charge the client or the patient for the whole vial, even though it was a very, very expensive vial, and they could have easily used it for another patient as well. But for the sake of trying to like rack up bills for their insurance to pay. So
yeah,
I don't know.
That's really helpful.
Yeah, I don't know if Proposition 23 is the answer, but I think it's a step in the right direction. I mean, also like as you can see, like the dialysis centers are just like blowing money at this so that it doesn't pass. So that's my 2 cents.
I love those 2 cents. I mean, that's what I like to hear, is somebody who has direct experience with interacting with what the prop will do. And so, yeah, it's an interesting one, right? Because for me, it's like, well, at face value, this seems really reasonable. And you can tell that the clinics are against it. I saw that piece. There was another little documentary I saw about it too. I don't want to go to one of these. As a type 1 diabetic, one day I might have to. Hopefully not. But yeah, it's like, it seems reasonable, but do I want to be caught up in their fight? So it's a really interesting proposition. Any other comments? Thank you. That was super helpful, Graciela. All right, let's go to our next complicated one. All right, so we have data privacy, and then the last 2 are going to be prison sentencing and cash bail. So this Prop 24 is another initiative state statute, got on with signatures. It expands the provisions of the existing CCPA law, the California Consumer Privacy Act, and creates.
Kathy, can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Hello? Who is that? I heard a Kathy, can you hear me?
Kathy, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Who is it?
Hey, it's Sudeshna.
Hi, Sudeshna.
Hi. I have a question, and I apologize. There's some delay, I guess, in my audio transmission, but on the previous one, so I have a friend who is on dialysis, and her argument was, I think if a doctor needs to be on site, her dialysis was going to be more expensive. And she was struggling already with the cost of dialysis. And her, she's in critical condition with her diabetes. And so she asked me last time to vote no, like that she did not want a doctor on site. And she said, this doesn't help me. And so I listened to her, and that's how I voted. So do we know how other patients feel about that?
I don't, but that's really, really helpful feedback. And Graciela, you got something? Let's go.
Yeah, so I guess it really depends on the person and the patient and how their coverage is going to offer to cover this kind of expense. But as an EMT, I've had to respond to multiple dialysis centers because a nurse couldn't get a port to flush, or something like I'm not going to go into the details, but like if a doctor could have been there, the patient could have continued their dialysis. But then because there was no doctor on site, this patient had to go to the ER to get their port fixed, which then was an ER bill. And then they had to get dialysis in an emergency setting because they had missed their previous dialysis appointment because the nurse couldn't get it to flush. So for some people, it would actually be really beneficial, especially people who often have complications at dialysis. So, I'm really sorry about your friend. And again, it's just going to affect everyone really differently.
And that's the thing. That's the thing with all of these propositions. That's the really important thing. That's why we spend time on these calls. That's why we spend time researching it, because none of them are easy. Everything is going to have a different effect on someone else. But that was really great feedback from both of you from each side. So thank you. That's totally what I'm after here. So let's talk about the CCPA. So that expands the provisions of the CCPA and creates the California Privacy Protection Agency to implement and enforce the CCPA. So we have a data privacy law already. And what this does is it expands it and it adds an agency to oversee it to make sure that people are complying with it. A yes vote supports this ballot initiative to extend the state's consumer data privacy laws, including provisions to allow consumers to direct businesses to not share their personal information. Remove the time period in which businesses can fix violations before being penalized, and create the Privacy Protection Agency to enforce the state's consumer data privacy laws. A no means, no, we're not going to do that. But let's get into a little bit more detail. So this gets a little complicated. So I had to read this one a lot of times. So Prop 24 would permit consumers to, number one, prevent businesses from sharing their personal information. Number two, correct inaccurate personal information. And three, we could limit businesses' use of sensitive personal information. And it includes all of that sensitive information. It establishes the agency to enforce and implement and impose fines. It changes the criteria for which businesses must comply with the law, which businesses, and I'll have more detail on that. It prohibits businesses' retention of personal information for longer than reasonably necessary. It triples the maximum penalties for violations concerning consumers under age 16, and it authorizes civil penalties for theft of consumer login information as specified. So what is it going to cost the state? Maybe $10 million a year for the new state agency, and maybe low millions for increased court and Department of Justice, so in order to enforce it. Unknown impact on state and local tax revenues due to the economic effects resulting from these new requirements of the businesses who are selling our data. So I just thought this was really interesting. We have a constitutional right to privacy in California as of 1972. It's in the Constitution. I think that's pretty cool. Of course, when they wrote it in 1972, they had no idea what we'd be facing here in 2020. And down at the bottom, I included a link. I looked up, oops, that was an accident. I looked up what the data privacy laws are all around the world. We don't have time to look at that tonight, but like for instance, we have the GDPR, which is the European Union's big data privacy law. So if you're interested in looking it up, it's there. Okay, so how does this compare to the law we have now? Alistair McTaggart, who is a real estate developer, he filed this initiative. So he actually filed the last ballot initiative in 2018. So what happened, we're saying, I don't remember voting on this in 2018, because what happens is when somebody brings up a ballot, sometimes it doesn't get to us, because what the proponents can do is work with the legislature. The legislature says, ho, 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 we don't need everybody to decide this. We got you, we'll decide it. And that's what happened. So the government of California passed this law. And so Alistair McTaggart said, yeah, okay, I won't do the prop I was gonna do in 2018. He contributed back then, and he's contributing now. So what he said his intention is to do this time is to go to the ballot. He didn't want to have it just solved by the legislature. He wanted to ask the people. So he described the law from 2 years ago as a great baseline, but he thinks there are additional rights that Californians deserve. Unlike the current CCPA, which the legislature passed, the ballot initiative couldn't be amended without the approvals of voters at the ballot box due to the state's constitution's limits on legislative alteration. So what he's saying is, the only thing I want to make sure is they can't undo the act. So he said there is basically unlimited resources on one side of the fight. If you don't do anything, they will win eventually. So that's kind of an interesting thing to say, because I didn't read that in the summary, right? What it says is that this ballot initiative couldn't be amended without the approval of voters at the ballot box. So what if it's poorly written? What if it has unforeseen consequences? So we elect lawmakers to take care of that stuff. And what this is going to say is, no, it's going back to the voters. And that's kind of tough. And you can see both sides of it. I can anyway, because on the one hand, I'm like, yo, I don't need to have this on the ballot every 2 years if something's wrong. Like, I voted lawmakers in to handle this for me. Why can't they? But his point, I get it too, which is the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons, they got all the money. So if they want to fight it, they're just going to keep hammering it, and they'll keep lobbying the lawmakers until they get their way. So there's really two sides to this, I can see. This Democratic senator says, hey, this is the right thing, no question. So in 2018, this slide is going to cover what the law covers now and what it says. The next slide will cover what the prop will do. So this one says, they already have to disclose to the consumer the personal information that has been collected about the consumer and the commercial purpose of the information on the consumer's request. So we can request that. They cannot sell our personal information to third parties upon the consumer's request. The key word here is going to be sell. So they can't sell it. But this is what McTaggart is saying is one of the loopholes. They can share it with one of their partners, right? So this is my sister company. I'm going to share it with them. I'm not selling it. They can still give it out though. It requires them to delete our personal info if we ask them to. And then this whole bottom thing is what sensitive personal information is defined as. It's long. We won't go through it, but I'll send out the presentation. So what does this change? So Prop 24 would give us additional abilities. So it would say that they can't share or sell our information without the request. So that's where the share sell comes in. It would make them disclose whether the business collects sensitive personal information, the types of information, the purpose of it, and the length of time that the business intends to retain it. So that fourth piece is the new piece. Other three pieces already covered. The fourth one is new. It says you can't keep it forever. It would provide consumers with an opt-out option for having their sensitive information used or disclosed for advertising or marketing. It would make them obtain permission before collecting data from consumers who are younger than 16, obtain permission from a parent or guardian before collecting data from consumers who are younger than 13, and correct inaccurate personal info upon the consumer's request. I'm not sure how that differs much from the current law. All right, so this is a good slide, I think, because it covers which businesses are required to follow it, and it gives this versus that. So 25 million annual revenue is consistent. Businesses that purchase, sell, or share the personal information of 50,000 or more is the law now. And it says, oh, up to 100,000 or more is the prop. So that's kind of interesting, right? Because when you look at it, you say, well, it's applying to bigger business and not smaller business. Why is that? One of the things that can go wrong with privacy laws is that every single business, whether they're big or small, whether they have the resource to do it or not, really has to take a look at what they're collecting. And good, right? Everybody should take a look at what they're collecting and what they're holding, but it can be a burden on smaller businesses. So Prop 24 says, no, you have to have at least 100,000 or more in order for this to apply to you. So that's a change too. This one is complicated because I can see in it, in each line, there's like positives and negatives to each thing. It's very complicated. If you keep the current law, if you vote no on Prop 24, there's going to be loopholes. If you enact Prop 24, there's going to be loopholes in there too. So this is a really tough one. And then the current law applies to businesses that earn 50% or more of their annual revenue from selling our personal info. And then this just changes. This is the selling or sharing. So 50% of their more is consistent, but they also can't get revenue from sharing it either. So that applies to them now too. Right. So this one is an interesting point about the law. So under both of them, businesses would be exempt from requirements when complying with federal, state, or local laws and subpoena. There's some slight differences there, but basically it says if there's a subpoena, they have to share it. And I think in this new law, they can say, oh, you hold it for this long if there's an active case. So who supports it? So we got some D's in there. We got Ro Khanna, who's one of our local reps. Andrew Yang, who's a former presidential candidate. NAACP for California State Conference supports it. Arguments for. So the first three are going to come from McTaggart himself. So we've come a long way, but we need to ensure that the laws are keeping pace with the ever-changing ways in which corporations are using our data. Sensible companies realize the regulation is coming. This isn't going to burn down the whole world law. It's not a law that puts anybody out of business. He says, especially post-COVID, people are going to be more sensitive to privacy concerns. So Consumer Watchdog says under Prop 24, a consumer can limit the use of their sensitive information, stop Uber from profiling them based on race, stop Spotify from utilizing their precise geolocation, and prevent Facebook from using sexual orientation, health status, or religion in its algorithms. So more privacy, right? And in addition, we don't have to worry about this being repealed because we're the only ones who can amend it. The only way else will be amended is if it goes back to the ballot. This fellow, Los Angeles Times columnist, if Prop 24 is defeated, the beneficiaries would be businesses that want to exploit your privacy without your consent, which at this point is almost all businesses are based on some sort of data collection. So this gal, Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote a whole book about this, says it builds and strengthens the current law. So it will give us among the best privacy protections in the world. So, and it protects us against lobbyists. So who's against it? United Farm Workers, the nurses are against it, ACLU is against it, and the arguments against. So this guy says, no one reads the thousands of words of legal fine print that you have to accept. The fine print is where you sacrifice your privacy. The same is true of Prop 24. Its 52 pages are full of privacy reductions and giveaways to Facebook and other social media platforms. So what some people are saying basically is that the way this law is written in such a way that there are actually some loopholes and benefits to these big companies. And so you get into that a lot too, where sometimes you have a ballot initiative, this boils it down, but on ballotpedia.org and in the ballot that you'll receive in your mail, it will actually give you the full text of the law. And if the law isn't well written, it can cause other loopholes and stuff for these other companies. So besides sowing confusion among voters, this is the second bullet, the initiative could reduce privacy rights that Californians gained under the CCPA. It appears that Prop 24 would allow businesses to create new pay-for-privacy schemes. So tech companies could downgrade service to those who cannot or will not pay an extra fee. This is unfair to low-income consumers, seniors, and people of color who are already struggling. We fear Prop 24 would undermine existing California privacy regulations by making it more burdensome. So that's kind of interesting. Like, does it really do that? So, could they say, oh, okay, well, if you want us to protect your data, like you have to pay? It's an interesting point. So then this third one says it fails us in two ways. First, it creates a loophole that allows commercial credit agencies and data corporations to sell personal information of small business owners. Creating the loophole weakens the privacy of small business owners and hurts Black, Latino, and Asian American small businesses the most. And second, it allows the continued use of neighborhood scores and fails to address digital redlining, a practice whereby lenders use a person's race or the racial makeup of a neighborhood as rationale for refusing to lend. So these are all the arguments. Well, not all. I think there might be more. No, those are the arguments against. It's very complicated is actually what this boils down to. There are a couple of media pieces on this as well. So relatively speaking, when you look at Prop 24, it's kind of small money. We just saw 93 million and you see 11 million, so it's kind of small money. And that fellow McTaggart was the main contributor. The opposition, PACs, not a lot of money. So the LA Times supports it. saying the question for voters is whether Prop 24 would make privacy protection stronger, whether it goes far enough to make a meaningful difference, and whether it would enable the state to provide even better protections in the future. The answer to all three of these is yes, according to LA Times. Although our current law is the strongest in the country, it has many shortcomings. Its limits apply only to the sale of data, so some sites have circumvented that. And that's one of several glaring loopholes that big companies are exploiting. Now, against it, these three, Mercury News, Press Enterprise, Orange County, and basically the one that I'll call out is the Mercury News, which basically says, look, we just got this law going. Why don't we give it a chance and see how it goes, and then we can fix it from there. All right. Questions, discussion. Does anyone know how they're going to vote? It's a complicated one. This one ain't easy. I'm going to go on, and then we're going to talk about our last two. So I'm going to stop share just for a sec. Hello, everyone. I'll bring up my second presentation because I actually was originally thinking that we'd need more time for this. Let me call up. All right. Restart my share. Okay, you guys, just two props left. This is it. And these are both closely related, prison sentencing and cash bail. The prison sentencing one, I'm gonna warn you right now, it's the hardest one we're gonna do. I mean, it's not really, but it's got a lot of fine print in it, a lot of fine print. So I'm gonna skip over some of the fine print, but again, I'll send out this presentation tomorrow morning. Cash bail one is a lot easier to understand at least. So it's, you know, there's plenty arguments for and against, but it's a lot easier to understand. All very complicated. Oh, I gotta get on this screen before. Okay, just another shout out to Ballotpedia. I love those guys. They're awesome. Give me a lot of good information. Prop 20, another California initiative state statute that got on the ballot with signatures. So it makes changes to policies related to criminal sentencing charges, prison release, and DNA collection. So a yes vote supports this initiative to add crimes to the list of violent felonies for which early parole is restricted. Recategorize certain types of theft and fraud crimes as wobblers, chargeable. Okay, I'll just give that wobblers a second. So you can charge a crime as a misdemeanor, which isn't very serious. You can charge a crime as a felony. So certain crimes it's black and white. This one's a misdemeanor, this one's a felony. There are some that are called wobblers. And what that means is that depending on the circumstances, it could be classified as a misdemeanor or a felony. So let's just clear that up. Okay. This also requires DNA collection for certain misdemeanors. So a no vote says, we don't want to do any of that. Let's get into it. So restricts parole for nonviolent offenders. Authorizes felony sentences for certain offenses currently treated only as misdemeanors. The summary is, so it limits access to parole programs established for nonviolent offenders who have completed the full term of their primary offense by eliminating eligibility for certain offenses. We'll get into this in more detail. Changes standards and requirements governing parole decisions under this program. It authorizes felony charges for specified theft crimes currently chargeable only as misdemeanors, including some theft crimes where the value is between $250 and $950. What you'll see is sort of interesting. I don't know if we have any law enforcement on the call, but I had listened to the Almaden Valley Community Association had done a little thing on the props, and they had people speaking for and against. The fellow speaking for it was in law enforcement, and I want to share some of his comments as we go along, and it has to do with this limit for how much you can steal. Requires persons convicted of specified misdemeanors to submit to collection of DNA samples for state database. Fiscal impact, increased state and local correctional costs, likely in the tens of millions of dollars annually, primarily related to increases in county jail populations and levels of community supervision. So what that's going to tell you right now is that we think that it's going to increase the population of our jails and prisons. There'll be increased state and local court-related costs. that could be more than several $1 million annually. So when you charge more things as felonies rather than misdemeanors, more court cases, increased state and local law enforcement costs, not likely to be more than a few millions of dollars annually, related to collecting and processing DNA samples. So the DNA samples are, of course, when they collect that from somebody and they put it in their database. So when they collect DNA from a crime scene, they just run that against all of the database. So what would this initiative change about criminal sentencing and supervision policies? So this ballot initiative would amend several criminal sentencing and supervision laws that were passed between 2011 and 2016. And there were 3 laws, and we'll go through them. This ballot initiative would make specific types of theft and fraud crimes, including firearm theft, vehicle theft, and unlawful use of a credit card, chargeable as misdemeanors or felonies, rather than just misdemeanors. The ballot initiative would also establish 2 additional types of crime in the state code: serial crime and organized retail crime, and charge them as wobblers. So this is what this fellow in law enforcement was talking about. He says that what we've been seeing in San Jose is that there's a group of people who will load into a car, they have a plan, they'll pull up to a strip mall, they'll run into a store, and each person will steal the exact minimum that they can steal, as something under, currently $950. And then if they get caught, they know that it's just going to be a misdemeanor, and they'll just go through town and they'll hit one after the other. And even if the police catch them, they'll say like, okay, thanks, just give me a ticket, it's a misdemeanor, let's get back in the car and do a few more and maybe we won't get caught. So that's the kind of thing that law enforcement is trying to fix with this. This ballot initiative would also require persons convicted of certain misdemeanors that had been classified as wobblers or felonies before 2014, such as shoplifting, grand theft, and drug possession, along with several other crimes, including domestic violence and prostitution with a minor, to submit to the collection of DNA samples for state and federal databases. So DNA collection is clearly a privacy issue. So if I shoplift, so if I steal something from a store, should that be enough to give the state permission to forcibly collect my DNA and store it? That's a question to think about. And then the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation has a parole review program in which felons convicted of nonviolent crimes, as defined in the law, could be released on parole upon completing their sentence for his or her offense with the longest imprisonment term. So it's like you convicted of this, you got 3 years for this, you got 2 years for this, you got 1 year for this. It's saying, look, once you hit that longest one, the 3-year one, we're going to say you're eligible for parole. It doesn't mean we're going to let you out, but it means that you can go in front of a board and you can apply for it. The ballot initiative would require the parole review board to consider additional factors, such as the felon's age, marketable skills, attitude about the crime, and mental condition, as well as the circumstances of the crimes committed, before deciding whether to release a felon on parole. They want them to have more scrutiny before letting someone out. So what they want to do is further limit the number of people who can get out early, and then they want to really make sure that the parole boards are analyzing more data before they decide to grant parole to a person. The ballot initiative would allow prosecutors to request a review of the board's final decision. The ballot initiative would also define 51 crimes and sentence enhancements as violent in order to exclude them from the parole review program. So what that is saying is that currently right now, what they're saying is nonviolent offenders can qualify for this sort of early parole. They earn points for good behavior and they can make it to the parole board earlier. But what they had said is that, look, if you're a violent criminal, then you don't get to go to early parole. If you commit certain violent crimes, you don't get to go for parole. So what this ballot initiative does, it defines more crimes as violent and restricts those people from early parole. So it's saying, okay, I agree with you. Violent criminals shouldn't be eligible for early parole, but you guys didn't classify enough things as violent. And I'm going to show you what some of those things are. And this is the last bullet point there. Currently in our state, counties are responsible for supervising paroled felons convicted of non-serious and non-violent crimes. Counties have discretion on whether to petition the judicial system to change a felon's post-release supervision terms or status. Ballot initiative would require the local probation departments to ask a judge to change the conditions or status of a felon's post-release supervision if the felon violated supervision terms for the third time. So basically what it's saying is 3 strikes and you're out. So if you continue to violate the terms, then you're not going to get to be on parole anymore. So that makes sense. So there's a lot of laws that this ballot initiative would make changes to. So we had AB 109 in 2011, Prop 47 in 2014, Prop 57 in 2016. These 3 measures were each intended to reduce the state's prison inmate population. According to Assemblyman Jim Cooper, the goal of this initiative is to reform the unintended consequences of reforms to better protect the public. Former Governor Jerry Brown disagrees, saying the initiative is the latest scare tactic on criminal justice reform. So this is sort of what we're getting to. You look at the next bullet point, right? Before those laws were enacted, before 47 and 57, the Supreme Court ruled, U.S. Supreme Court ruled, that overcrowding in the state's prisons resulted in cruel and unusual punishment, and affirmed a lower court's order to reduce the prison population. So flat out, we had so many people in prison that the Supreme Court was like, cruel and unusual punishment. Like you either have to bill more, you can't keep this many people under this condition anymore. Basically, you got to reduce the people in prison. The government told us that. So AB 109 shifted the imprisonment of non-serious, non-violent, and non-sexual offenders from state prisons to local jails. So what they did was they shifted some stuff from the states to the counties. They shifted some inmates from the counties to local jails. Okay, so AB 109 also made the counties rather than the state responsible for supervising certain felons on parole. So it shifted it to the counties. Counties were not too happy about that at the time, but we're okay now. Prop 47, which we approved in 2014, changed several crimes, which the measure considered non-serious and non-violent, from felonies to wobblers or misdemeanors. Former Governor Brown developed Prop 57, which voters approved in 2016. Prop 57 increased the parole chances for felons convicted of nonviolent crimes and gave them more opportunities to earn sentence reduction credits for good behavior. So there's a couple of things to unpack in here, and one of them is this last line, which is basically the way that Governor Brown decided to address the overcrowding. Part of what he said is, look, if you give people more opportunities, if they know that they have a chance to get out earlier, it's going to encourage better behavior. They're really going to be working towards getting out instead of just staying in. So give them a chance, give them a light at the end of the tunnel, give them something to work for. Prop 20, there's another thing in here which basically says, like, as I've been saying about all of these props this whole time, they're complicated. There's always going to be unintended consequences. What Prop 20 is saying, too many loopholes. Too many truly violent people were classified as nonviolent, and we have to fix this. So this is a very complicated proposition. And we're not done. So the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice, a nonprofit, they described this set of laws as a successful sentencing reforms that reduced overcrowding in state prisons. Andrew Doe, chair of the Orange County Board of Supervisors, described the measures as California's dangerous trifecta. So basically you have people on one side saying, hey, it reduced all the overcrowding. You got people on the other side saying, yeah, and it made our society more dangerous. So let's fix it. Complicated issue. Complicated. Oh, look, so this I want to point out on Ballotpedia, these are like drop downs. Like, so this is like background on all of these different things. So we'll go through this pretty quickly because it's a lot. It's just going to be a lot. So when we approved Prop 47, which reduced penalties for certain theft-related crimes, Prop 47 reduced penalties for grand theft of items valued at $950 or less, shoplifting of items valued at $950 or less. And so it's all about kind of less than $1,000, you're going to get off a little bit easier. So the 2020 ballot initiative would amend that to start including, okay, firearm theft is not a misdemeanor, theft from an elder. What they're saying is identity theft. Anyone who's ever been the victim of identity theft in any way will know that that is a pretty serious thing. They're saying, hey, that's not a misdemeanor. Theft of, a vehicle theft, somebody steals your credit card. So basically it's saying it just expands this. This stuff isn't misdemeanors. Let's fix it. So that's what Prop 20 would change. And this down here at the bottom gets into serial crime and organized retail crime, which is what I were talking about, are these criminal rings where they're really just going out trying to do this. And what they're saying is, don't treat that like a misdemeanor, because these folks are out there, they're doing it repetitively, and it should be treated seriously. DNA collection. So when we had Prop 47, what it says, so they're required to collect DNA from adults and juveniles convicted of felonies, arson, or crimes requiring them to register as sex offenders. The State Department of Justice files the profiles with the FBI. So when Prop 47 was approved, several crimes were changed from felonies again to misdemeanors, meaning that government was no longer required to collect DNA samples from these individuals. So again, Prop 20 would say, no, let's re-up the ante on that and say, even though this is still a misdemeanor, you have to give DNA for this now. So shoplifting, grand theft, all of this stuff, they're saying, we also want you to give DNA, even if it's a misdemeanor. The ballot initiative would also require law enforcement agencies to collect DNA samples from adults for several crimes that Prop 47 did not affect. So they're saying, hey, if you are a domestic abuser, you're given DNA. If you're prostitution with a minor, we want your DNA. Again, domestic abuse, you hurt somebody, willfully causing or willfully permitting great bodily harm or death to an elder or dependent adult. So they're saying, hey, you know what? You're going to have to give us DNA if you commit those crimes, right? Prop 57. So this is about criteria to consider in nonviolent offender parole program. So before you decide parole, this is more stuff that you have to think about. So Prop 57 required the Department of Corrections to enact a parole review program in which felons convicted of nonviolent crimes could be released on parole upon completion of the sentence. Okay, we already went through that. So it excluded certain felonies which were deemed violent from the parole program. So if you're a murderer, you can't get that early parole. Mayhem, arson, rape, kidnapping, it's not a pretty list. And they're saying, hey, all of this stuff, you don't get early parole if you do this stuff. So it established a parole program in which the department reviews an inmate's institutional records. It evaluates their threat to the public safety and decides whether to refer the inmate to the Board of Parole for further consideration. Before making a decision about parole, the BPH is required to review their criminal history, institutional records, and input from victims' families, and the DA's office. The 2020 ballot initiative would allow prosecutors to review an inmate's information. The ballot initiative would allow prosecutors to request a review of the BPH's final decision. So what you're saying is a prosecutor says, hey, I don't agree with that. I don't like it. I want to see a review of that. That's what this says. So it gives a little bit more information to the prosecutors. And then the DCR to make reasonable effort to locate the victims. So this ballot initiative would require them to give reasonable notice to crime victims before an inmate is reviewed for parole, allow victims to be heard in parole considerations, and allow victims to participate in the review process. This initiative would also require that they make a reasonable effort to locate and contact crime victims who were not registered with the state. So they say, we want you to try a little harder to get the victim's voice in that room. So again, this Prop 20 it's really a tough on crime. It's really a tough on crime prop. I'm not even going to go through all of this, but it really greatly expands the list of crimes that make people ineligible for or unsuitable for parole. So there's all kinds of stuff in here. If we read them out loud, we'll get very depressed. These are all very serious crimes. Criminal street gang, if the crime created a potential for serious injury to persons other than the victims. So if they not just hurt somebody, but could have hurt other people, there's a lot of things on this list. And I'm not going to go through it all. We'll send this out tomorrow. So the criteria that they would need to consider in deciding whether an inmate is suitable for parole includes this long list. So the offender doesn't have a juvenile record, they have minimal or no crime history. So it's just like a long list of criteria that they would have to consider when deciding whether someone is suitable for parole. It's a lot in this one. This one's jam-packed. And this is just a list at crimes that will be defined as violent. So basically, Prop 57 defines certain crimes as violent. Prop 20 says not enough. All of these other crimes are violent too, and these should be not eligible for this early parole program. And there's, it's true, attempted murder, solicitation to commit murder. I mean, there's a lot on here. It's very bad. The list is very, very long. So I will leave this to your review at your leisure. And then we have more changes to probation and parole supervision. So the background is this law, okay, it required counties rather than the state to supervise felons convicted of certain types of crimes after their release from prison. It affected felons who were convicted of crimes that the law described as non-serious and non-violent, who were not classified as high-risk sex offenders or classified as needing treatment from the State Department of Mental Health. It gave counties the power to decide methods for punishing violations of supervision conditions, such as flash incarceration. Counties were also given the option to petition a hearing officer to change a felon's supervision conditions, incarcerate a felon in jail for longer than 10 days, or refer a felon to a reentry court. So, whereas AB 109 gave counties discretion on whether to petition the judicial system to change a felon's post-release supervision terms or status, this ballot initiative would require local probation departments to petition to revoke the post-release supervision of an offender who violated the terms of supervision for the third time. So 3 strikes, you're out. For those of you who don't have a lot of background on the 3 strikes, you're out law, these were laws that were in the 90s. Crime was rising all over the country, and a lot of states passed some very tough on crime laws. One of them was 3 strikes, you're outlaw. And that was like if you're convicted for any 3 felonies, like that's it, you're done. You're locked up forever. You did 3 crimes, you're locked up. You don't get to come out. There were a lot of tough on crime initiatives at that time, which is basically what resulted in the prison overcrowding that we see today. So this is really a push-pull. It's a very complicated initiative that kind of comes down to, are you more in favor of prison overcrowding, or are you more in favor of just trying to keep more people off the streets? It's not an easy one to decide. So who favors it? I want you to be careful in this one, because some of you might see a name on there and think, I don't agree with anything that guy says, but just don't, again, you don't want to just give a blanket. I really want you to think about this and don't agree or disagree based on who supports it, but it is interesting to see who supports and who opposes. So the sheriffs, the peace officers, all of these folks are going to be in favor of Proposition 20. And I want you to note that there's a reason why law enforcement officers are going to be in favor of Prop 20. It's because they actually deal with these offenders all the time. So they really see who, okay, I had a couple of people who dropped out and came back in. So these folks really see and participate in this process. And so they see the offenders, and that's why they're supporting this. So arguments in favor, Jim Cooper says that right now, crimes that are considered non-serious and non-violent, and that allow you to get out of jail or prison earlier, you can drug and rape somebody and be eligible for this early parole. You can rape a developmentally disabled person, spousal abuse, drive-by shooting, human trafficking of a child. That we never had any idea that that was a loophole, that these should have been classified as violent. They shouldn't be eligible for early parole, but they are. And then this gal, the CEO of Crime Survivors, Inc., when California voted on Prop 57, they were promised that would only apply to nonviolent offenders, but that word does not mean what they thought it meant. That's kind of a nod to the Princess Bride, haha. So it's the same argument, right? Who opposes it? Well, Jerry Brown opposes it because the 3 pieces of legislation that were enacted under his watch. He did it, so of course he's going to oppose it because he says, look, I did my job, I reduced the prison overcrowding, don't believe this. The Democrats oppose it. The ACLU's position is actually kind of complicated. Well, they're against it. There's always nuances, but the ACLU is against it. Arguments against. So here's the ACLU right at the top of the list. They would like us to believe that California is in dire straits in order to reverse many of the reforms we have put in place since 2012. We urge the proponents of this new effort to reject the Trump administration's return to the failed 1990s era of harsh sentencing and mass incarceration, as the voters of this state have consistently done, and instead work toward keeping California's crime rates the lowest in history. I don't really know where Trump plays into this, except that I know that the current push of the Republican Party in a lot of ways is to say, hey, the streets are dangerous, everything is dangerous, let us help protect you. So this person says this is a prison spending scam at a time when we are actively closing prisons and reallocating funds towards what's needed in communities. So what they're saying is, I mean, people make money from prisons. They're saying, don't lock people up. Let's make sure they have the resources they need when they get out. And you're going to see a lot of that. Governor Brown says Prop 20 wants to basically eliminate all hope in the prison. Men who have been given decades will have no chance to earn their way back into society. And that's fundamental to any kind of criminal justice system, that while you oppose punishment, you make room for redemption and rehabilitation at the prison. So I won't go through all of it. While I did note that the law enforcement agencies are for the most part in favor of it, our district attorney in Santa Clara County opposes it. He said we had prisons that were bursting at the seams, unconstitutionally overcrowded, so unconstitutionally crowded that we had to send our prisoners to different states. We had 14 new prisons built over a period of time, but one public university. We had high crime rates. Do we want to turn back the clock, or do we want to move forward as we have been over the last few years in this state? So those are the arguments for and against. Not much money in the bigger scheme of things, $4.5 million, $5.5 million. And it's the law enforcement who put up the money. And then the opposition is a lot of various donors, including Chan Zuckerberg. And then media editorials, these are basically going to be saying the same exact thing. Now, there were no media editorials that Ballot could find in support, and then there were a few in opposition. And I think this is the last slide I have on this, because this one is so complicated, but this is a pretty telling slide. It shows our incarceration. It showed the number of people in, our state imprisonment rate for 100,000 residents from 1995 to 2019. Put it tough on crime laws, it kind of leveled out, went back up, and then starting when these laws were enacted, right? So this is AB 109, it started to go down. This is Prop 47, it went down even further. And then this was Prop 57, went down even further, and now it's at its lowest that it's been in a really long time. So the question you have to ask yourself, and there are a lot of questions to ask yourself on this proposition, but do I want more people in prison? And there's always going to be, I don't know what kind of ads you're going to see on TV. I don't watch TV ads, but there's always going to be one person who's let out who goes and does something bad. There's always going to be that person to be held up and say, but you say, if one person gets out, is that okay, as long as overall we're reducing the number of people who are imprisoned and locked out of society, and the profits that people making off of prisons? There's no easy answer in this one. There really isn't. I'm pretty sure that's my last slide. Prop 20, that was a doozy, huh? Prop 20, you guys, that one really kicked my ass last couple of weeks. I read it so many damn times. Man, I think I know how I'm going to vote on it, but I'm curious to know if anyone else knows how they're going to vote on it. You're like, what? I fell asleep 10 minutes ago. Anyone? Any comments?
Just a comment on like the nature of these kinds of laws that like are tough on crime and have historically not really shown to lower the crime rate at all. These laws are typically, the way they're written and the way it was discussed, to me it looks really disparate. If you're familiar with that word, the textbook definition is fundamentally unlike, but if in a legal sense it's something that applies to a certain group of people in a different way than it applies to another group of people. And so, when you were talking about it, I saw things like, does this person have a juvie record? And I think of inner city Black kids and Latinos, and like they're gonna have a record, and things like that. And how I can imagine, the whole wobbler rules of like prosecutors, who are they going to throw these felonies at? Is it going to be people of color? Probably. I don't know, like, you know, lots of speculation, and I'm throwing a lot of personal bias out there, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement that's been going on. But, you know, I think of like just prosecutors trying to like charge younger not children, but like younger adolescents, I guess, 18, 19-year-olds with like these felonies. And then my boyfriend is a criminal defense attorney who's actually sitting right behind me. He's listening in. He says that, you know, it's more likely that when a prosecutor charges someone with a felony, that they are more likely to take the plea bargain. And so you're more likely to convict an 18, 19-year-old of a felony if you scare them into thinking you're being charged with a felony. And so that's just something I wanted to throw out there.
No, I appreciate that. It's a really interesting question, and there's a lot of, I don't really like in these sessions to say how I'm going to vote. I can definitely see the arguments on both sides. Does anyone have a comment? Is anyone in favor of Prop 20 or think they might be in favor of it?
I think that there's portions of it that I agree with, and there's portions of it that I don't agree with. And so per your advice the last time I heard you speak, that means that I should vote no.
Well, I don't know. Should you listen to my advice? I don't really know. But, you know, hey, it's cool that you're listening. I love it. All right, I'm going to move on. We'll just take a few more minutes. I'm so sorry. I thought these sessions were going to be an hour and 15 minutes. Looks like they're both going to be an hour and a half. My wife is giving me the tisk-tisk. She's very disappointed, I can tell. I'm so sorry, honey. All right, we got one more, you guys. One more, and we got the toughest one out of the way. Let's talk about Prop 25, you guys. 12 out of 12. All right. Prop 25, oh, I like a veto referendum. This is our only veto referendum this year. So what Prop 25 does is it replaces cash bail with risk assessments for suspects awaiting trial. So you don't know how this works. Everybody watches crime shows, right? Go to jail, and they say, well, can you be let out of jail? The judge will set bail. And it's something ridiculous. You know, the bail is basically set to say, I'm going to make you give a certain amount of money, because I know I'll give you that money back when you come back for your trial. So they're just trying to ensure that they come back. But those numbers are set all over the place. We have a for-profit cash bail system. So once they set the bail, someone is making a profit off of that. What happened is, was it last year, I think? Our legislature passed a bill that said we want to replace cash bail. And instead of doing cash bail, because we don't think it's fair, we want to use risk assessments. So instead of saying, let's just make you pay money to get out, which is unfair to people who don't have money. Let's do a risk assessment and just see, do we think you're going to come back for your trial, and what factors can we take into account there? They passed that legislation. But what happens is, this is not a state initiative statute. This is a veto referendum. This is where the people who were against that legislation said, I'm going to let the people veto you. So this is where we actually get a chance to veto a law that's already passed. So this is just really interesting. I love a good veto referendum. We don't get those very often. So a yes says we're going to uphold that legislation and replace the cash bail system with risk assessments. And a no says, no way, we don't want to do what you guys said we should do. Let's take a look at it. So a yes vote. A yes vote approves and a no vote rejects a 2018 law that replaced the money bail system with a system based on a determination of public safety and flight risk. It limits the detention of a person in jail before trial for most misdemeanors. So it says, like, look, hey, you can't keep people in jail for a long time for just these little things. Fiscal impact, increased state and local costs, possibly in the mid-hundreds of millions of dollars annually. So that's a big number. We've seen tens of millions. We haven't seen hundreds of millions. For a new process for releasing people from jail prior to trial. So it's like we have to create this process. These risks, how do you decide? Have to create it. It's going to be expensive. It's unclear whether some of the increased state costs would be offset by local funds currently spent on this kind of workload. So they'll have less things to do in other areas, more things to do in some. Decreased county jail costs possibly in the high tens of millions of dollars annually, because we're not going to keep people in jail as much. Unknown net impact on revenues related to people spending money on goods rather than paying for release from jail. So basically, what would they have done with the money if they didn't have to use it to get out of jail? How does bail work in California? As of 2019, we utilize a cash bail system to release detained criminal suspects before their trial. They pay a cash bond to be released from jail pending trial with the promise to return to court. The cash bond was repaid to suspects after their criminal trials were completed, no matter what the outcomes. Just as you show up, you get your money back. The Judicial Council of California, which is the rulemaking department of the state's judicial system, described bail as a tool to ensure the presence of the defendant before court. The state's countywide superior courts were responsible for setting the cash bail amounts for crimes, and judges were permitted to adjust the cash bail amounts upward or downward. Suspects could post bail with their own money or through a commercial bail bond agent who pays the full bail amount in exchange for a non-refundable premium. In California, there was no law setting or capping premiums on bail bonds. So according to the California Department of Insurance, agents typically charged around 10%. So, even if you have, $100,000 bail, you're going to lose 10% of that. So you're just going to lose that money, even if you come and show up to court. So basically, if you get arrested and you have to go to court, in order to get released, you're just going to lose 10% of that bail money right there. And that is pretty harsh if you end up not being convicted. Pretty harsh, tough. So what was SB 10 designed to change? It would make us the first state to end the use of cash bail for all detained suspects awaiting trials. California trailblazers. Okay, legislation will replace our cash bail system with risk assessments to determine whether they should be granted pretrial release and under what conditions. They would categorize a suspect as low risk, medium risk, or high risk. Suspects deemed as having low risk and low risk to public safety would be released from jail, while those deemed at a high risk would remain in jail with a chance to argue for their release before a judge. Those deemed medium risk could be released or detained, depending on the court's rules. SB 10 would exempt suspects of misdemeanors with exceptions from needing a risk assessment to be released. So like, okay, misdemeanor, just go home, you're fine. Okay. So SB 10 would require the courts to establish a pretrial assessment, these divisions, pretrial assessment divisions, which would be tasked with conducting risk assessments and making recommendations. So it's like right now we're assessing how much bail there should be. And what we're going to say is, no, we'll decide risk assessment instead. They would decide which risk assessment tools are valid for use. It would not itself mandate what factors the assessment tools need to consider, but the bill would state that the tools shall be demonstrated by scientific research to be accurate and reliable. So that's not written into the law, what the criteria are. They'll have to figure that out. So what I will say is that the American Bail Association, all of the people who are making money from this, are against it. So they didn't like it. So the American Bail Coalition, they organized the PAC, and I love the name they give it, against the reckless bail scheme. Well, there's money involved, so that's okay. So they're the ones who put this up. So what they're saying is the only debate we're having right now is the current system worse than the alternative? And the answer is no, it's not. It says that the new one wouldn't be any better. So California's 3 ACLU affiliates opposed SB 10. And this is where it gets interesting. So why does the ACLU oppose SB 10? Because it seems like the ACLU, you might be in favor of it because it could be fairer. But what the ACLU is saying is, why don't we see how these risk assessments are determined? So the ACLU is a little bit concerned that the risk assessments won't be any more fair than the bail. So make no mistake, the bail industry is not interested in equal justice or equal protection under the law. So basically they're saying like, look, we don't like what they're doing, but they called for new legislation to address racial bias in the risk assessment tools. So like we know, anybody who studied it knows, cash bail system is not fair to, well, certainly not fair to low income people. It's certainly not fair to minority people of color. And what the ACLU is saying, let's make sure this new thing that we're putting in place will be fair. So the ACLU's position is a little bit complicated. Who supports it? You see a lot of D's. You got governor up in there, a lot of people we know, California Democratic Party. So these people all support it. Arguments for, it's basically for fairness. I won't go into all of this because it's already getting late and I've got to finish watching the rest of that presidential debate. But this I cut and pasted in here because I went and looked this up. Did you know that the United States and the Philippines are the only two countries in the world that allow companies to operate for-profit bail operations? The industry is powerful and profitable. The top 10 companies cover an estimated $14 billion in bonds every year, raking in $2 billion in profits. California accounts for about 25% of that business. I didn't realize that like we had that in common with the Philippines, like that. I didn't realize that. It was really interesting. So these are folks who oppose it. And it's mostly the bail. Interesting note that I had kind of hinted at before, the NAACP. You see them on a lot of these support and oppose, and some of them you think about like, well, why would the NAACP support or oppose that? Well, there's a little bit of funny business going on there too, where it's legal, but what some people are saying, they're accusing the people in charge of the NAACP of just kind of pay to play, kind of taking money to their private corporations in order to give support to their side. So the NAACP is a little bit complicated on this, so you can look that one up too. Arguments against, they just don't think, they say, okay, while bail reform is necessary, getting rid of it isn't the answer either. I added a couple of things here. Oh, yeah, that was about the ACLU. I want to say I've said everything that had to be said. Let's look at the money. 8 million, 9 million, that's not chump change. And then the no, who are all these guys? American, I don't even know why these folks. I think I looked it up and I don't remember anymore. It's gotten so late. And then these are editorials. So these newspapers all think that we should support Prop 25. And then there weren't any that said it was against it. So what do you guys think? That's our last one, cash bail. Risk assessments. Any opinions? Anyone know who they want to vote? I'm tempted to say how I would vote on this one, but I'm going to resist the urge because I would like very much to remain neutral. Frankie, what's that? Frankie, how you going to vote? You're a thumbs up. You're yes on 25. Will you say why? No. Yes, he will. He's unmuting himself.
I think just because a lot of poor people can't afford the bail, and it's not fair that a lot of these people get for minor crimes are being left in jail just because they can't afford the bail.
Good position to take. I hear you. I hear you on that. Mrs. Mikami, Karen Mikami, I noticed you changed your name from Mrs. Mikami to Karen. I see you nodding your head as well. Any other opinions on this? Anything else? These were tough ones tonight, you guys. You're troopers. You hung in there. Now it's your turn. Okay, here's what you have to do. Think. Don't just watch ads. Ask questions. Do research. We all have local ballot measures, so I only covered the state ones, but there's going to be a couple for your county, maybe one or two for your city, so check those out. Do your research. That's why I wanted to get this done early, because there's plenty more research to do. Candidates, if you're a person who believes that the best way to do government is to try to enact laws for smaller numbers of people and localize it, then it's super important that you do a lot of research on your local candidates. So who are the people in the California legislature making these laws for us that we're looking at vetoing? Well, that's really important. And I think a lot of us, myself included, don't spend enough time looking at our local candidates. And vote, vote, vote. Vote early. Whether you mail it in, drop it off. My wife wants to clarify, just once. Just vote once. But get out there and vote. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I really, really appreciate it. If I helped anybody with this complicated stuff, then it makes me very happy. Does anyone have any more closing comments or anything before we say goodbye for the night?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Great.
It's nice to see you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.
Tomorrow, I'm going to post the recording. I'll send out the presentations. I love you guys. I love you guys. Talk to y'all soon. All right.
Bye.
Have a good night. Bye.
Thank you.